All right, guys, welcome back to Section 12. Section 12 is where we're going to talk about issues specifically affecting women, children, and economics and the environment. Um, so, women have always had a kind of special place in human rights law because they've been overlooked, if that makes sense. They're people in a lot of fields, everything from medicine to sociology, kind of have treated historically men as the default, men as the example of humanity, and then women as special or different, when in fact there are more women than there are men in the world. So they've also had women have historically had this role as, as property, but even after that, they've had a role as subservient, lesser accessories. So the vast majority of rights were gained first by men, first by rich men, then by all men, then by women. So it wasn't until 1979 that the United Nations passed a gender discrimination law, essentially. Okay, essentially saying via international law that discrimination, legal discrimination against women, is not okay. But not only is this convention against the legal discrimination of women, it also says, what I find very interesting, that countries must take all appropriate action to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct that maintain the discrimination. Now, obviously, some of the worst discrimination via gender is going on in places like Saudi Arabia. But in all countries, there is at least some social and cultural patterns of conduct that treat women as lesser. Okay? Here in the United States, we still have what we call women's work and men's work. And while it's not legally required that women do women's work and men do men's work, there is a huge amount of social pressure to push women into jobs that are considered socially appropriate for them, and out of the jobs that are not considered socially appropriate for them. And then, of course, the women's work gets paid far less. Another big problem we have all over the world is guilt by association. So women are oftentimes punished because their husbands do something, because their fathers do something, because they're not seen as agents in their own right. They're punished because they're seen as kind of accessories to the man who's doing the thing that deserves to be punished. And this can happen in politics. This can happen in the criminal justice system. This can happen in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways, where women face punishment for what the men close to them either did or are perceived as having done. Does that make sense? So this is a really hard thing to talk about, because it's a very horrible, painful, frankly disturbing practice, but it's still far too common in the world today, and it is an issue that directly affects women. So we're going to talk about it, but it is very tough to talk about and tough to hear. So again, if you need to pause this video and take a break, totally understand. But there are many places around the world today, especially in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, but also in other places, where female genital mutilation is still practiced. And this is where the female genitalia is um, surgically removed, essentially, either part of it or all of it. And it's done in lots of different ways for lots of different reasons, but it's always um, abusive and controlling and disturbing. Okay? So there are kind of three levels of how the female genital mutilation can happen. The kind of lowest level is I'm going to mispronounce this. I'm not very good with medical terminology. Clitoridectomy. Actually, I think I did that right. This is where just the skin, the hood surrounding the clitoris is cut away. But the clitoris has an incredible number of nerves on it. I believe, I'm not a medical doctor, but I believe it has the highest concentration of nerve endings anywhere in any male or female body. Because of that, when you cut away the protective outer covering over the clitoris, that A, causes extreme pain, and B, causes the body to not feel those nerves firing as much over time. So it makes it harder for the person to feel anything on that clitoris, which obviously impacts sexual performance. The second level of female genital mutilation is excision, where not only you're moving the hood and the skin surrounding the clitoris, you're removing the clitoris itself. Okay, that entire organ is cut out, often accompanied with the inner labia of the vagina. This is all just cut off and removed. In the worst of the female genital mutilation, it's called infibulation. They take off the clitoris, the hood, the inner labia, the outer labia, and then they sew up the vagina until it's closed. They leave just a little hole for urine and menses to come out, but everything else is sewn up. And then on their wedding night, the new husband, essentially cuts it open and can be assured that his bride is a virgin, is essentially kind of the reasoning behind it. But it is absolutely a mutilation of the female body, no matter what level you're talking about. Usually it's done on girls between 4 and 8 years old. It's not done on babies. It's not done on adults. It's not done post-puberty. It's done on very young women, 4 to 8 years old. Usually, most of the time, it's done in places where there's no anesthetic available. So the girl's family usually, or some members of the group, have to hold her down because obviously it's extremely painful. So it's a very tough thing even to talk about, but it would obviously be a lot worse to actually go through. I can't even imagine how painful, how horrible, how scarring feeling that without anesthetic would be. It's not, so a lot of commentators try to compare it to male circumcision, but it's not equivalent at all. Circumcising males does not prevent them from getting an erection or having orgasms or any of those normal sexual functions. It's also usually done on very small babies where they aren't old enough to remember it, whereas female genital mutilation is done on girls usually old enough to remember it. Um, so ultimately, it's really done to control female sexuality, right? In cultures where they believe that sex is for procreation and not for pleasure, um, they wanted a way to make sex less pleasurable for women, and no matter what level of female genital mutilation you're talking about, it certainly makes sex less pleasurable. So the kind of the ultimate goal and the ultimate belief is that if the culture mutilates the genitals of these young girls, they won't go out having sex for pleasure. They will only have sex for procreation, as these cultures view is the right way to do it. Um, there, there are a lot of myths that have grown up around female genital mutilation in these different areas that practice it or have practiced it. Um, many many cultures believe that it helps the woman avoid illnesses such as masturbation. They view masturbation as an illness that needs to be cured with this female genital mutilation, but also other illnesses, STDs, um, hysteria, other kind of things like that. There are some cultures that believe that a clitoris can literally kill a man. I know many women who wish that were true, but obviously it's a myth. Um, it's become such a part of many cultures that they've come to find it aesthetically pleasing. They think a natural female genitalia is not aesthetically pleasing, and only ones that have been cut or removed are beautiful, if you will. And then there are groups that believe that women can't conceive a child unless they've had these procedures done, which all four of those are obviously false, obviously ridiculous, but they're still believed in a lot of places in the world today. This is data from UNICEF from relatively recently, showing that in a lot of places in the world, this is still a very common thing. Even in the 21st century, this happens to a huge number of young girls, which is, needless to say, I believe, disturbing. Another human rights issue that impacts women directly is Sati, which is from the kind of South Asia, India, Bangladesh, that kind of area of the world. And it's essentially the tradition of if a woman's husband dies, he will be burned, his body will be burned in a pyre, a fire, a large fire thing. And according to this, the widow should throw herself onto the fire and burn herself to death to go with her husband. So in many places and at many times, this was kind of required. And at other times it was voluntary, but at the same time, voluntary doesn't always mean voluntary. But essentially, this has become a cultural practice. But what most people kind of believe is the impetus for this cultural practice is that essentially nobody wants to take care of a widow economically, right? A female widow in these cultures is a drain on resources. So if nobody wants to take care of this widow, the culture sees that as, oh, well, then she should go with her husband, i.e. kill herself in a horribly painful way. Thankfully, it's not as common today as it was in history, but it's still not unheard of today. This still happens in some places and sometimes. and I can't even imagine being pressured into doing this. That terrifies me. In other cases around the world, there are women's reproductive rights are controlled, either temporarily or permanently. Even here in the United States, there's a Supreme Court case called Buck versus Bell from the 1920s that says that essentially the government can sterilize you against your will. In that case, I believe it was a case of mentally challenged women and men, I think, being sterilized. But essentially the court ruled that if the government can show need, they are allowed to sterilize men and women, but usually women, against their will. And that court case has never been explicitly overturned. But these involuntary sterilizations happened in the United States up until the 70s. There are places in the world where they're still happening. In China, because they have a problem with overpopulation, they've had a rule where couples are only allowed to have one child apiece. And if couples have more than one child, they can be forcibly sterilized or given an abortion against their will. This couple here in this picture actually had to flee China after being forcibly sterilized because they had, I think, 2 or 3 children. And this control of a woman's ability to reproduce, whether it's forcing them to have a baby or forcing them to not have a baby, is taking away a woman's reproductive rights. Yeah. Okay, we're going to end this section there. We'll be back for the next section.